I am so honored to have Jim Phelan here with me today for a video cast. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you, Frederick. Nice to be here.
You have this very distinguished career and including, by the way, the Distinguished University Professor title at The Ohio State University, where I am delighted to also share space with you. Let's talk about how you got into rhetorical narrative theory, Jim. What's your origin story?
Okay. Well, I guess I'll start with why I went to graduate school, which is that I was really taken with the activity of reading fiction, particularly the novel. And as an undergraduate, it was sort of very appealing to me that it would be possible to make a life in which I could get paid for reading and teaching and writing about fiction. And to some degree that was a little bit naive, and because I didn't really understand what the graduate study of English was like at the time. And when I first got to graduate school, I was really pretty thrown in the sense that it felt to me that what was happening in my classes didn't have that much connection to what I was doing when I was reading, to prepare for class or whatever. And and this sort of the whole thing about what it meant to be doing scholarship in English studies, I had trouble getting my head around. But then at the end of my first year, I took a course with a professor named Sheldon Sachs. And the course was 18th century fiction, British fiction. And on the first day of class, there were about 30 of us in the class. He said, all right, let's just, how many of you have read Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice? Everybody, I think, raised their hand. He said, all right, well, tell me what it's about. And people started going around, and one person said, well, it's about, the power of first appearances, first impressions. And somebody else said, well, it's about marriage in an inquisitive society. And, we went on like that for a while. And then Sachs paused and he said, I'm struck by the fact that nobody has said the story about how two people meet and fall in love and get married. And we were like, well, yeah, but that's so obvious, right? And all this other stuff is what's really important. And he was like, no, well, if you want to explain how you get to that other stuff, you need to pay attention to that story. And I was like, yes, this is somebody who's sort of connecting to making that connection between what I was doing as a reader and what I would be doing as a sort of more or less professional, graduate student. And one of the interesting things about that course then, was that Sachs sort of went on to say, if we ask these questions about our experience, we can then ask about, well, what's the cause of those experiences? What's going on, in the ways in which these stories are put together, and how are authors anticipating what readers might do, and how are readers responding to what authors are doing, right? And in that way, I had a glimmer of, there is maybe a place for me in this profession in which I could, write and think about that and so on. And so more broadly and sort of over time, sort of jumping from the origin story to, what rhetorical narrative theory is doing, in part, it sort of starts with the idea that narrative is an action, right? An action in the sense that, in the way in which I've come to define narrative, somebody's telling somebody else on some occasion and for some purposes that something happened, right? And that's that telling for some purpose kind of gets at the rhetorical situation. So somebody, trying to do something in relationship to somebody else by using the resources of narrative. then there are other dimensions, lots of other dimensions to it too. I mean, there's sort of the general idea that narrative is a way of knowing and thinking. Narrative is a way that we make sense of our experiences in the world. That's compatible with and very much a part of it. So as, in a way, as I'm making sense of my experience, I'm also, doing that for a certain kind of purpose in a particular occasion in relationship to a particular audience. So that's kind of the big picture, and that sort of project. All right, well, how do we explain this? How does it work? What are the varieties of ways in which people have engaged in storytelling and responding? And that's a big project. And then the other side of it is to say, keeping with the idea of the experience of it, that it's a multi-dimensional thing, right? It's good stories engage us, cognitively. They engage us emotionally. They engage us ethically. They engage us politically, ideologically, and so on. And then once you say that, you say, okay, well, how do those things relate to each other? And how might we be able to give an account of those kinds of things? So,
and you started in yeah, you started publishing on this already in 1981, and of course continue to do that. So you've really, in terms of enriching and nuancing the concepts and the devices used to construct narrative experience, wow, you've like a career of this. And then of course teaching students. Somebody telling somebody else, you've kind of already mentioned this. So for people that might be outside of our profession, could you maybe give us a couple of examples of how we might bring this into everyday lives, our everyday lives today?
Sure. I've recently written a piece on the impeachment inquiry, and the way in which narrative was very much a part of that. And also the way in which that's very much a kind of contest of narratives. So, the Democrats and the people who brought the impeachment had one narrative about what Trump did in relationship to Ukraine, and the Republicans who were defending him had another one. And then the question is, all right, well, how do they play out, right? And one of the interesting things that I noticed by sort of thinking about, this contest of narratives from a rhetorical perspective was that in Devin Nunes's concluding statement at the end of the period in which the House Judiciary Committee was, considering the articles of impeachment, the contest was really sharp because Adam Schiff had gone and he made his closing statement, and basically it was, his account of what Trump had done and the way in which it was, violating the Constitution and by trying to get a foreign power to investigate a political opponent and using, funds appropriated by Congress for that purpose. And so he had a pretty clear narrative and a pretty clear sense of, what the narrative meant, and, what and the way in which that led up to the sort of inescapable conclusion that they should, he should be impeached. Nunes, instead of contesting the narrative directly, right, sort of opted out of the contest and instead did an ad hominem attack, not so much on Schiff, but on the whole democratic process, right? And he went back to the election from 2016 and said, okay, since that time, the Democrats have been trying to oust Trump, right? And he characterizes that as an effort to overturn the election and all that kind of thing. So it was this really kind of very fascinating example of sort of what we would expect as the normal contest in the impeachment, Nuna is opting out of that, but in opting out of it, substituting a whole other narrative. And one of the things that's interesting about it is that if you think about it then from the position of somebody else, somebody who's being told, right, by opting out, Nunes sort of doesn't give any reassurance to somebody else who might be troubled by, Schiff's account, right? Or the actual, raw material out of which the narrative is being built, right? What happened in that phone call to Zelensky and all that? So he opts out of that, and but instead is trying to, make this ad hominem case that depends upon this other narrative, which also has lots of holes in it. That doesn't take a lot to analyze it. But if you think about somebody else too, right? Who is he really speaking to? Right? He's not speaking to the American people who are worried, or even Republicans who are worried about what Trump did. He's speaking to Trump, right? He wants Trump to approve what he's saying, right? So this narrative about, they're trying to oust me from the beginning is very appealing to him. And he's also to somebody else, it's also his Republican colleagues in the Senate who are going to vote, right? And he's trying to provide cover for them to defend Trump, right? But it's also fascinating in that he seems, at least, he elects not to try to provide the cover by giving an account of the actual events, right, that can counter what Schiff and the Democrats have proposed, right? So it's really, I think it's very illuminating to sort of what happened if we think about it from the perspective of rhetoric, right? And then, of course, you can think about, all right, well, what did happen? And finally, you say, there's something about power going on here, and there's something about the way in which, Republican control sort of was more important than the facts, or at least the plausible narrative of the facts that was offered by the Democrats. And that's sad. But again, I think this way of thinking about it sheds some light on it.
Absolutely.
So that's one thing. I mean, another was just, how do we tell stories to each other? What do we say on a particular occasion? And I think what I would emphasize is that what we say on a particular occasion is really influenced by our understanding of whom we're talking to, and what we want to accomplish in relationship to that audience, right? So one of the consequences of this is that rhetorical narrative theory, by focusing on this nexus of tellers and audiences and purposes, right, takes a different stance toward the sort of elements of narrative, right? It's very interested in the elements, but rather than building a theory based on the elements and their relationships, which is sort of what structuralism has done and what a long tradition of narrative theory has done, it sort of flips that and says, well, those elements are important, but we can better see their importance when we think about how authors use them in relationship to their audiences on particular occasions for particular purposes.
Yeah, that's really, thank you. That's so crystal clear to me. Jim, have you done work on Twitter and the teller, the purpose, and the audience in those spaces? And has it changed at all what you kind of, or has it added to the kinds of devices that you've identified in just regular fiction or in nonfiction news?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I haven't done any detailed analysis of it, right? But it seems to me that it fits. What you would be then thinking about, though, is that you have different kind of constraints, right? The limited number of characters, and the need to be pithy, and so on. So certain kinds of resources would get more attention, right, than others, right? So a lot of stuff. So like if we were to make the sort of standard list of narrative elements, we would say, character, event, time, space, perspective, so on, right? I think in Twitter, what you'd see most often is character, perspective, time. Space would probably be, less important, right? Again, not in all cases, but it's just the idea that, okay, in a given situation with a particular set of interests and purposes, these elements would probably become more prominent.
Right, that makes sense. Yeah, I don't think, I mean, just on a really simplistic level, I don't think I've read a tweet that has kind of embedded levels of sort of temporality, like flashbacks or flash forwards.
Right, right, exactly, yeah.
So you've kind of shared this already with us, but what's the big vision? I know that you've shared some of this, but yeah, what is the Jim Phelan research program?
Yeah, so I mean, over time, I think I've really come to try to think about how close I can get, or how far down the road, I suppose is what I mean. How far down the road can I get to giving a kind of comprehensive rhetorical account of narrative, and narrative as a way of knowing, narrative as a way of acting, doing, right? And so, I've written books about style. I've written about character. I've written about plot, although thinking rhetorically, I've sort of transformed plot into progression. I've written a lot about narrative perspective. So I have a book on, character narration. And in each of these books, I've also, paid a lot of attention to the readerly side, right? So I'm looking at elements of narrative, but I'm looking at how they're used by authors and then the consequences for readers. So that's led me into thinking about ethics in particular, and the relationship between affect and ethics. It's that sort of, that's the direction that I'm going. I have written some about time. I haven't written a lot about space, but again, a little bit of that. So just trying to think about all the elements, how they relate, what are the larger consequences of them for the author-audience purpose relationship. So another piece of that that's sort of developed, it came with the book I wrote on character, which is my second book, Reading People, Reading Plots. And I started with the question of, well, what is a character, right? And at the time, it was in the 80s, a lot of discussion was going on among structuralist critics that character was either simply a group of predicates under the heading of a proper name, or even a more extreme version that in print narrative, character was just black marks on a blank page, right? And that, given my interest in experience, right, that never seemed very convincing to me, right? But at the same time, I thought, okay, yeah, well, they're tapping into something, right? Narratives are constructed, right? So I developed this idea that character had three components, what I call the mimetic. Characters are like people. A synthetic, characters are constructed, and they play roles in the narratives in which they appear. And then there's a thematic component. Characters have some ideational dimension, and they also have a kind of representational dimension, right? So, race and ethnicity, gender, and so on. The character, so a powerful female character, like Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, or whatever, Cisneros is the protagonist, right? That's a those characters have strong mimetic components, but they're also have representative functions, right? Austin and Cisneros are thinking about not just this woman, but women, and not just this class position, but class positions, and not just Austin doesn't think much about race. She presupposes that we're in a white world and so on, whereas Cisneros thinks a lot about that. And so thinking about the mimetic thematic relationship, and then also to think about, all right, if in cases like this the mimetic thematic purposes are pretty important, well then how do you handle the synthetic to advance those mimetic thematic purposes? And then beyond that, then I began to see, okay, well, this mimetic thematic synthetic thing also applies to characters, but it also applies sort of more broadly to kinds of interests readers can have, right? And then those interests can vary in different narratives, right? So, sometimes we want to be immersed in the life of another person, but other times, there's value in the kind of metafictional thing in which where authors are foregrounding the fact that they're working with kind of constructs and characters aren't real, and things like that. So
yeah, no, that's great. I remember sort of how beautifully and potently you write about Zora Neale Hurston in that collection, Analyzing World Fiction, that I put together. So why bring this into our classroom spaces today? You talked about your experience as a graduate student and feeling a little bit not quite like it was working for you for different reasons. Yeah, tell us why it's important today.
yeah, well, I think there's lots of things to do with it in today's classroom, and one is that you can start with readerly responses. And then the question, and then the rhetorical move is to honor those things, right? But then to say, all right, a couple things. One would be to say, like Sachs taught me way back, what are the sources of your responses? And then when you get questions about disagreement, which you often do because we are different people and so on, is to then say, all right, well, why might we disagree in the way that we do? How can we use our disagreements as ways to sort of further our understanding of text and so on? And furthermore, so that's just sort of a kind of methodological way, but the larger vision still, holds, right? That if we can understand Jane Austen or Cisneros or Toni Morrison or whoever, we have the capacity to grow, right? To change, to learn new things, to see the world differently, right? And so the idea of wanting to, so when we talk about the somebody else, right? You can talk about actual readers and then also talk about authorial readers, right? Authorial audience, right? So that the hypothesis, the rhetorical model suggests that, okay, an author, going back to the idea of author, audience, purpose, nexus, the author has a certain kind of audience in mind, right? So when the actual reader comes, part of the challenge for the actual reader would be, all right, what is the author expecting of me? What am I supposed to know? What do I have to do? How can I go from where I am to join that hypothetical audience that the author has constructed. And then if I can do that, then these kind of payoffs can happen, right? And I can learn from these other people. At the same time, though, I also can come back to the idea of, well, I'm still this person. What am I going to do with my experience in the authorial audience, right? And that's something I think that we can talk about productively in the classroom as a group, right? And there, so in trying to get people to join the authorial audience, the idea is to try to see what kind of consensus we can reach, right? We don't have to, you don't have to force it. You don't have to say, all right, you have to read it this way, right? And you can also recognize that even that consensus is a kind of tentative one, you know, and you might change it later on the next time you read, or, you know, read with another group. But there, the idea is to try to reach consensus. But then when you take the next step and you say, all right, well, having done this work and been in this authorial audience, asked to have these ethical judgments, asked to think about the world in this way, what do I think of it? What do we think of it, right? And there we might get different answers, and that's good, and that's rich, right? Because a couple things follow from that. We learn more about our own commitments, right? I think about this because these kinds of things are important to me, right? Then we can also then learn we can go back into the text and say, okay, well, this part of it, you know, I can say, all right, let's say I'm resisting this part of the text. Then I can go in and say, all right, why am I resisting? What is it that the author has done? Should I keep resisting, or should I, you know, is there, what had she done maybe to try to anticipate my resistance? And so on. So I think at that, you know, that it's when it works, it's a pretty productive classroom. It's pretty,
yeah, no, it's great. We all know that representation matters for better and for worse, but providing our students and us generally with tools to understand the nuances of how that is sort of delivered, or how that is kind of interfaced with us, really, really important, right?
Right, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's a way, you know, students can feel that their ideas matter, right? It's not just it's just a question of, all right, you know, distinguished university professor is going to tell you what to think about, you know, X, Y, and Z. You know, it's like, no, we build this together, and and we have this common thing of trying to understand this art object that somebody has made for us, and then we think about, all right, well, if we get to the understanding, then what do we do, right? And we can build that together too.
Jim, you mentioned earlier a kind of impulse, a research impulse to be comprehensive, and maybe even a kind of unified theory, right, developing from all of your work. And I see this especially in the directions that you've been going institutionally here at OSU with establishing medical humanities, and of course this very much a part of a narrative in medicine field, I suppose. What is all of this? What is narrative in medicine? What is medical humanities?
Yeah. So I think there are a couple ways to go into that. First, I talk a little bit about how narrative medicine fits within my sense of the narrative theory field more broadly. And then I could talk a little bit about my role, and then a little bit about the medical humanities. So, you know this, but I'll just, you know, review it. One of the things that happened in narrative theory is the narrative turn, right? It's sort of a recognition that narrative didn't just belong to literature and literature departments, literary critics, but that it's something fundamental to multiple disciplines, right? So think about law, what I was saying before about the contest of narratives, right? What's a trial but a contest of narratives? So in the legal profession, learning something about narrative and the way it works makes a lot of sense. In business, they're very interested in, narratives of change. How do you change the culture of a business, right? What goes into all that? And then you can go down the list, right, to the relevance of stories for so many fields. Well, one of those fields then was medicine. And part of the insight there really is that storytelling is essential in so many levels of medicine. But just sort of get it to the core, the encounter between a caregiver and a patient is an encounter that's all about narrative, right? So what's your history, right? What brings you here today, et cetera. So with that, if you start with that as a kind of, first motivating idea, then you can say, all right, well, it makes sense for people, both patients and caregivers, to learn more about narrative. And then you get to the idea that, okay, learning about narrative, becoming narratively competent can enhance medical competence. It can, influence more positive outcomes and so on, right? So then narrative medicine kind of comes in right there, right? Say, okay, the more we can understand the way narrative works, and the more we can understand the way it works in particular occasions and purposes of medical encounters, the better those encounters can be. So that's the impetus there, and so to some degree, there's a kind of, it's a two-way traffic thing. There's a kind of outreach to medical community, doctors, medical schools, et cetera, to say, okay, there's value in learning about narrative and the way it works, right? But at the same time, there's traffic in the other direction to say, all right, well, what might be distinctive about medical narrative that existing narrative theory hasn't fully done justice to, and so on. So you set up this kind of dialogic thing. So there's a lot more to say about that, but I'll pause there and then just sort of jump to medical humanities. So what narrative medicine is a kind of example of what medical humanities is interested in more broadly, or its project more broadly. And I understand that project to be saying that the perspectives of the disciplines of the humanities and the social sciences as well, medical humanities is often a shorthand for medical humanities and social sciences, that these perspectives on medicine have a value that is potentially as important as the traditional perspectives of biology, anatomy, the sciences that go into what we think of as medicine and becoming expert in medicine and so on. So that's the big project of medical humanities, and I want to stress that it's not oppositional, right? Nobody in medical humanities is saying, stop doing biological research, but it is saying, all right, well, let's put that in some kind of context, right? Or to say, all right, there are all these technological developments, right? But let's think about how those technological developments can be, more productively implemented. So there's a lot of, there's so much, medical record keeping now, which is digital. right? But one of the consequences of that is you go see your doctor, and the doctor has his or her head in the computer typing and not looking at you, right? And how does that affect the encounter and the storytelling and the sharing and the dialogue, right? So it's these kinds of that's a sort of a simple example, but I think it illustrates some of what the medical humanities is trying to do.
Yeah, no, that's really great, wonderful. Of course, also helping those in the healthcare professions to ask maybe different questions as well, right? To ask
Right.
different questions. Having trained in, having taken a course in, women's gender sexuality, suddenly a doctor's kind of thinking about, has another frame to bring into this
Exactly.
space,
Right.
right? To,
Right. Right.
and a different narrative is going to emerge from that, right?
Right. Right.
So,
There's also interesting evidence about, and it's still developing, but one of the big findings of medical, sort of medical training in our American medical schools has to do with effects on empathy. So first year medical students score very high on standard empathy scales, and fourth year medical students score low, right? So what's happening in their training, right? So part of the idea would be to say, one hypothesis, and there is now research developing which supports this hypothesis, that engagements with narrative, engagements with the humanities actually can counter that decline in empathy among medical students.
right, powerful, yeah, really powerful space.
Yeah.
Jim, this is sort of a selfish question because you published this wonderful piece in the Oxford volume on comics that I put together, but how would you teach or talk to someone, or how did you write about even this memoir, this cancer memoir? Cancer made me a shallower person.
Yeah, well, first I want to thank you for the invitation to write the piece and the opportunity to do it, and I'm delighted to be part of the collection. Um, well, I think go back to principles of rhetorical theory. Think about the somebody telling, um, the audience, the occasion, and the purposes, right? So one thing I think in terms of the occasion, in 2006, right? So Miriam Engelberg gets diagnosed with breast cancer at a relatively young age, right? So how does she respond to that diagnosis? Well, one of the things that she comes to realize is that writing comics and drawing comics provides a certain kind of there's a certain therapeutic value to it. Right? So, but then you can say, well, why might she be doing it this way? Right? Why? And you can see in the title there, "Cancer Made Me a Shallow Person." There's a certain kind of irony that she's drawn to. And there's a way in which that title and that irony shows a kind of an awareness of her relationship to another kind of popular and even celebrated narrative about dealing with cancer, right? Cancer made me a better person, right? And now it's interesting, I think so she's writing into that to some degree. She's writing into a context in which that narrative is out there, right? And this it's worth paying attention to in trying to think about some of the choices that she makes as she constructs her narrative. So I would say it's striking and interesting that she says, shallower, right? She doesn't go, obviously, and there she's in dialogue with the idea of better, right? She doesn't say worse, or she doesn't say, um, you know, anything stronger than that. And then there you get that kind of, um, humor in the irony. Um, so So we could start with that. Okay, so she's going to take this stance and position herself in relationship to this larger narrative, and give herself a kind of permission, right, not to be the noble sufferer, the one who's on this journey to, you know, um, self-improvement, right? She's going to give herself that permission, um, and then so I'd sort of start there. And then I'd start to say, all right, well, what then, how does this get played out, right? And there are a couple of things about it that are particularly significant. One is that the irony of the title is something that's pervasive in the book as a whole. But what's interesting is that the irony really has, let's say, um, different effects and different vignettes that she tells us about. And one of the things that's striking about irony is that the relationship between the literal meaning of an utterance or presentation and the ironic meaning can vary, right? So sometimes the um, literal statement gets inverted, right? But sometimes something about the literal statement carries over, right? And there's a whole range of things between that complete undermining of the literal and the, sort of partial carryover of the literal. And Engelberg really takes advantage of that variety, and we can see it. There's a splash page with the title "Everything Is My Enemy." And on that page, she has a whole range of things, from X-rays that she's had on her body to, bad food, hot dogs, things like that. And what's interesting about it is that some of the things, from a more objective perspective, what we know about cancer and its causes and so on, some of them are plausible things, and some of them are implausible. But for her, what she's capturing is that subjective feeling that everything is my enemy, at the same time that she's able to say she recognizes that everything is not my enemy, and say, but some things are my enemy. Right, so it's a very kind of layered irony, and she's really good with that. So I would try to get students to see this kind of thing. Two other things that I would point out that are really important is that it's a serial narrative, right? So basically, what she does is she's writing as she's going through diagnosis, treatment, aftermath, and so on. So it's not a single retrospective. Okay, I look back and I can tell you the story of my cancer and what happened to me. It's these different snapshots, and there's so that creates a different kind of relationship between the teller and the audience, because neither of them know the outcome. Right? So we're sort of immersed in this ongoing, unfolding narrative, as is she, right? And that has lots of consequences for the way in which the whole book is put together and the effects it has. So I would pay attention to that in the classroom. And then the third thing, which is connected to that, is that as a serial narrative, she's doing sort of short takes, right? And so she'll have one about ace bandages. And it's a funny thing about um, after her surgery, she's wrapped in the largest ace bandage that she's ever um, imagined even, right? And then she riffs on that for a couple of pages, right? And then she's got another one on the survivor metaphor, right? So the idea of, cancer, you have cancer, you go through treatment, and then you're a survivor. But she's critical of that. What does that mean, right? If you die, was it your fault? The warrior and the survivor kind of thing, right? So, these are very different kind of things, and we get one, then we get another, and so on, and then we sort of build the larger story out of all of them, out of the collection of them. But what's interesting to me is that some of them are more lyrical than narrative, in the sense that what she's trying to do is sort of take an aspect of her experience and, in a way, sort of freeze it and then unpack it. Let us see what it means to be at this moment in this, on this larger journey. And so it becomes this kind of hybrid form. I think it's lyrical and it's also narrative, because there is a sense of progression from diagnosis to treatment. And ultimately, she stops writing when, after the cancer comes back, and she's pretty much knowing that she's going to die. So it's very powerful. And you can see from the slide, from in your example here, that it's a very simple kind of thing. The drawings themselves are not elaborate. It's black and white and all that. But out of that, she creates this really very, very rich lyric narrative.
Right, and powerfully kind of a counter and sort of honest narrative, right, in and through the visuals and the text. Yeah.
Right. In that sense, I think she is, even though she's focused on her experience, she does provide a window. You think about the thematic part of it, right? So it's a highly mimetic, her individual experience, but it is a kind of, going back to the idea that she's giving herself permission, right, not to be on this journey of self-improvement. She's providing a model in a way for others, and also broadening, for people who aren't suffering or whatever, broadening your sense of, what it's like. So I find it to be a really very powerful book.
You have built, talk about unified theory. We have this sort of Center for Narrative, Project Narrative at OSU. We have Narrative Journal, the Society, International Society for the Study of Narrative, the book series. And I know that, of course, it takes many people to do this, but really you're the kind of gravitational center. Well, I guess I could ask you, where do you find the energy? But more sort of generally, yeah, I guess this gets back to the point of kind of the research program question, why?
Well, I guess there's a certain kind of faith, right, that it matters, right, that narrative is important, right, that it's sort of, again, go back to narrative as a way of knowing, narrative as a way of doing, and then you start to see it. It's everywhere, right? And all these things we've talked about, right? There's a faith that getting to understand them actually gets us to understand who we are and what we're doing in the world and the way the world works in a sort of better, richer way, right? And then, of course, the rhetorical the way I think about it, right, the rhetorical way is one way. It's not the only way, and it's, um, and so if you can provide a space for multiple ways and provide, opportunities for um, so many scholars to pursue this, pursue in distinctive ways a common interest, then that's a wonderful thing. And I've been fortunate, to be able to have opportunities to do that, to, have colleagues like you and the kind of contributions you make and, everybody in Project Narrative, right? I'm sort of we have different kinds of overlaps of interests and, things that we share, but we're all distinctive too, right? And I think that's really, really valuable. And so, most of my writing really is in the rhetorical mode, but when I think as an editor, I want to think about, the plurality of productive ways of engaging with narrative and to provide promote that and so on. And there's something also, about doing that, and this from your own extensive editing work, you keep learning, as you're engaging with the ideas of others, and that expands your own thinking, and so I feel very fortunate that I have such good colleagues. I have a good relationship with the press. The Narrative Society, I think, is a wonderful organization. And I give you credit for giving us the idea in Project Narrative to do the Summer Institute, and the opportunity to work closely with you and others teaching together. That's great because you learn more and you get to know your colleagues in a way that's particularly valuable. So
Yeah.
why? I mean, I care, and I've had great opportunities and great colleagues. So I think that's the answer.
Yeah, it's a real model of kind of productive, progressive, harmonious model for kind of, engaged scholarship and scholars to kind of share space and build knowledge, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. 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 I mean, the hard part of being an editor is saying no to people when you have to, reject things and so on. But, you try to do that in a way that's also, productive and helpful.
Absolutely.
When I was starting out, one of the first essays I sent was to PMLA, and I'm young and ambitious and so on. And I got such negative and hostile rejection readings. I still remember one of them said, page 28 should be cast in stone and hung around Phelan's neck. That's a kind of, punishment for producing it. It's sort of like the version of the Scarlet Letter. So that sort of informed the way I try to function as an editor. Like that's the negative example.
Right. Yeah, and those experiences I know for both of us are, we never leave them behind. They're right there in our rearview mirror, and I know you and I and others are very constructively critical. So Jim, yeah, what's next? I don't even like the summa. It seems like it keeps moving for you.
Yeah, well, I want to keep learning. I think that, the medical humanities and the narrative medicine thing have been very good in that regard in terms of, making me think some more about, maybe applied narrative theory, in that regard. I do have a contract to co-author a book with a doctor who's John Vaughan, who I taught with here for a while, and when we first started the narrative in medicine undergraduate class. And he's since gone on to Duke, but we have a contract with Routledge to do a narrative medicine book that could be used in classrooms. And I also have a book on that's somewhere that I've started, and I still have a long way to go, but on sort of interpreting narrative from a rhetorical perspective that I would hope could also be used in the classroom. So those are the two kind of immediate bigger things. You know, in addition, I want to keep, you know, Project Narrative going and see, you know, financially healthy and, you know, continue to develop the medical humanities at OSU.
Thank you, Jim, so much for sharing your journey, your time. You are a builder of not just story worlds, but of fields, and have shaped so many lives in such a positive way. Thank you.
Thank you, Frederick. It was a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for, you know, making this so easy and congenial.